Today, we're going to talk about the impact analysis of macroeconomic events. My name is Yu Dinghong. I'm going to talk about question 1. First, what is federal funds rate? Why has federal funds rate been kept at a very high level in the United States? Federal funds rate is the range of interest rates that Federal wishes commercial banks borrow and lend their excess reserves to each other overnight. Federal funds rate is kept at a high level due to the high inflation rate. The policy is kept to slow down the speed of price increase. What is discount rate? Why did Central Bank of Taiwan increase its discount rate to deal with the inflation problem in March? Discount rate is the interest rate that commercial banks give to Federal for short-term loans. The government of Taiwan increased the discount rate to help control inflation. The increase of discount rate leads to the increase of borrowing costs. The increase of borrowing costs lowers the aggregate demand, so the inflation can be controlled. What is real exchange rate? Use the open macroeconomy model to explain why capital flows have caused real exchange rate to rise in USA. Graphical analysis is required. Real exchange rate is the rate of which a person can trade goods and services between two countries. First, the supply of loanable funds is reduced. Next, the real interest rate increases. Third, NCO is reduced. Fourth, the quantity of dollars ready to be exchanged into foreign currencies is reduced. Fifth, the real exchange rate appreciates. What is nominal exchange rate? Draw a diagram for Tokyo's foreign currency exchange market. Nominal exchange rate is the rate which a person can change currencies between two countries. The supply curve shifts when USD depreciates or appreciates. The demand curve shifts when yen appreciates or depreciates. Suppose that the initial equilibrium nominal exchange rate was 150 Japanese yen per US dollar on April 28. Show why continuous capital outflow from Japan caused nominal exchange rate to rise to 160 Japanese yen per US dollar on April 29. Explain how Central Bank of Japan pulled the nominal exchange rate down to 155 Japanese yen per US dollar in the end of that day. Graphical analysis is required. First, continuous capital outflow makes capital goes to US, so it decreases supply of USD, and real exchange rate increases. Then, the Central Bank of Japan sell USD and buy yen, which increases the supply and decreases the real exchange rate.
Hello, my name is Zheng Yutong, and I'm going to answer the question 2. For the question 1, the trade war between the USA and China can influence aggregate demand in China negatively. Tariffs imposed on Chinese export to the US can reduce demand for Chinese goods, leading to a decrease in net export and thus a decrease in aggregate demand. Therefore, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. For the question 2, the departure of foreign companies from China can also negatively impact aggregate demand. These companies often contribute to employment and investment, and their departure can lead to a negative effect on the investment factor, thereby decreasing consumer spending and overall aggregate demand. Aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. For the question 3, the real estate crisis in China make people less willing to buy houses. Therefore, the investment factor decreases. Besides, it also caused the wealth of consumers to decrease, making aggregate demand decreases. thereby aggregate demand curve shift to the left. For the question for the stock market crash will decrease the investment in China because investors may become more cautious, leading to reduced spending and investment, thus decreasing aggregate demand. For the question 5, in the short run, aggregate demand shift to the left, causing quantity of output and price level to fall. In the long run, China government can make a policy to let short-run aggregate supply curves shift to the right, making the quantity of output back to the equilibrium. However, the price level will fall again. For question number 6, to mitigate short-run economic fluctuations, the Chinese government could implement fiscal policies, such as increasing government spending on infrastructure projects to stimulate aggregate demand. Additionally, target monetary policies like reducing interest rates and can encourage borrowing and investment, further stimulating economic activity. Question number 7. The Central Bank of China can respond to short-run economic fluctuation by adjusting monetary policy. For example, it could lower the reserve requirement ratio for banks, providing them with more liquidity to lend to businesses and consumers. Additionally, the central bank could engage in open market operations to increase the money supply and lower interest rates, stimulating investment and consumption.
Here is the background of question 3, Russian invasion of Ukraine. The European Union adopted a number of sanctions in an attempt to mobilize the war effort. One sanction was a complete import ban on all Russian seaborne crude oil and petroleum products. The sanction sent energy price to historic high. First, use the graph of energy market to explain why this sanction caused the energy price to rise sharply. The EU banned all Russian seaborne crude oil and petroleum imports. The supply of energy in the product market decreased, causing the supply curve to shift to the left from S1 to S2, while the demand curve remained unchanged. Consequently, the market equilibrium price raises. Second, how could this sanction affect overall price in the European Union in the short run, output and unemployment? In terms of price, in the short term, price level will rise significantly, mainly due to the inflation caused by raising energy prices. On the export side, raising energy prices have increased production costs, and the competitiveness of EU export may decline because higher costs may lead to higher product prices. If EU export become more expensive and less competitive relative to other countries' products, export volume may decrease. In terms of unemployment, due to raising energy prices and increased production costs, some companies may reduce production, resulting in less labor being needed and raising unemployment. Third, if EU authority would like to solve the inflation problem, what kind of physical policy is appropriate for the EU authority to implement? EU authorities should implement austerity fiscal policies. By reducing government spending and increasing taxes, they can effectively reduce aggregate demand, ease the pressure on raising price, control inflation, and ultimately stabilize prices. If EU authority would like to solve the recession problem, what kind of monetary policy is appropriate for the EU authority to implement? The EU authorities are well suited for implementing expansionary monetary policy by lowering interest rates and increasing the money supply. They can stimulate people's desire for consumption and investment. thereby promoting economic recovery. Could EU authorities use a single policy to simultaneously solve both inflation and recession problems? No, because the policy goals of solving inflation and economic recession are conflicting. Solving both problems simultaneously through the single policy is difficult. Austerity policy can control inflation, but exacerbate economic recession, while expansionary policy can stimulate economic growth but exacerbate inflation. Thereby, EU authorities need to balance between the two policies. Here is the graph of two monetary policy. As you can see in the right-hand side, it shows the impact of austerity policy. The AD curve shift to the right. It means that AD will decrease at the end. And in the left-hand side it shows the impact of expansionary policy. The AD curve shift to the left. It means that the AD will increase at the end. Here is the background of question 4. In the past decade, quantitative easing policy was often used by major economies such as USA, Japan, and EU to deal with its recession problem. Those economies could no longer use conventional monetary policy to lower the short-term interest rate due to the liquidity trap in the money market. Therefore, they chose to use the quantitative easing policy to lower the longer-term interest rate. The main goal was to stimulate the economy by increasing aggregate demand. Here is the first part. Use a graph of money market to explain why an increase in money supply cannot lower short-term interest rate. In the liquidity trap area, the money demand curve is very flat, so an increase in the money supply cannot significantly reduce interest rate. As at this time, there is excess liquidity in the market, and any new money supplied will be saved rather than invest or consumed, so short-term interest rate remain unchanged. As you can see the graph, the central bank increased the money supply, and the MS curve shift to the right from S1 to S2, but the demand curve remain unchanged. Here is the second part. What is quantitative easing policy? What is the difference between quantitative easing policy and conventional monetary policy? Quantitative easing is a non-traditional monetary policy tool adopted by the central bank to achieve the same effect of stimulating economic growth as interest rate cuts. Is usually implemented by the country's central bank during an economic downturn or recession when interest rates are ready to close to zero or cannot be lowered further. First, their purposes are different. The purpose of conventional monetary policy is to influence consumption, investment, and inflation rates by adjusting short-term interest rate to achieve stable economic growth and price stability. Quantitative easing is used when short-term interest rates are close to zero or cannot be lowered further. QE aims to lower long-term interest rate, increase the money supply, stimulate aggregate demand, and promoting economic growth. Here is the third part. Introduce the quantitative easing policy adopted by USA between 2008 to 2014. The first round of QE1 was implemented from March 2009 to March 2010, was a scale for approximately $1.725 trillion, averaging over $100 billion per month. It was mainly used to purchase $1.25 trillion of mortgage-backed securities, $300 billion in U.S. Treasury securities, and also $175 billion in agency MBS. The second round of QE2 was implemented from the end of November 2010 to June 2011, with a scale of approximately $600 billion, mainly used to purchase long-term bonds issued by the Treasury, with an average monthly purchase amount of $75 billion. The third round of QE3 was implemented in September 2020. Its target agency MBS for purchase with 25 billion purchased in September and 40 billion every month since October. What sets QE3 apart from the previous two rounds is that it had no clear implementation deadline and was intended to continue until the US job market recovered. In January 2030, QE3 was intensified. In addition to continuous purchase of 40 billion in MBS per month, the Federal Reserve also began purchasing 45 billion in long-term government bonds per month, increasing the total monthly bonds purchased to 85 billion.
The Federal Reserve decided to start reducing the scales of QE in January 2040, reducing the monthly scales of bond purchase by $10 billion to $75 billion, designed to $5 billion reduction in U.S. Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed security. The Fed exceeds QE in October 2040, and it is expected to raise interest rate around 250. In the fourth part, explain why the quantitative easing policy could increase aggregate demand. One reason is that QE lowers long-term interest rate through large-scale purchase of government bonds and other financial assets that drives up the price of those assets, thereby lowering their yields. For example, long-term interest rates. Lower long-term interest rate reduce borrowing costs for businesses and consumers, promoting more investment and consumer spending, thereby increasing aggregate demand. Here is the last part. Use a appropriate model to show how the quantitative easing policy would shift to aggregate demand curve and influence output, overall price of economy. Quantitative easing stimulates investment and consumption by increasing the money supply and lowering long-term interest rate, thereby increasing aggregate demand. In the graph, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, raising the economic's real output and price level. This process helped the economic recover from recession, boosting overall economic activities and unemployment levels.
The fifth portion mainly discusses the economic policies implemented by two U.S. presidents, for instance, from China. The fifth portion mainly discusses the economic policies implemented by two U.S. presidents. For instance, Trumponomics included lowering the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21% and imposing high tariffs on imported goods mainly from China. In contrast, President Joe Biden called for tax increases on corporations and wealthy individuals. First, let's discuss the differences between supply-side economics and demand-side economics. Supply-side economics focuses on increasing the overall supply in the economy. For example, it encourages businesses to produce more, invest more, and hire more employees by lowering taxes and reducing regulations, thereby promoting economic growth. On the other hand, demand-side economics emphasizes boosting economic growth by increasing the demand for goods and services. This can achieve through measures like increasing public spending, implementing progressive taxation, and enhancing consumer purchasing power. Next, let's look at the intentions behind different policies of the two presidents. President Trump might have believed that lower taxes would encourage businesses to increase production, investment, and employment, thus stimulating economic growth. In contrast, President Biden might aim to redistribute income by implementing progressive taxation and increasing consumer spending, which drives demand for goods and services. Thirdly, how can Trump's policy influence the market for loan funds in the USA? When the tax rate was reduced to encourage domestic investment, the demand curve in the market for loan funds shifted to the right from D to D1. Additionally, the supply curve in the market for foreign currency exchange may have shifted to the left. Overall, this leads to an increase in the real interest rate. a decrease in net capital outflow, an increase in the real exchange rate, and a decrease in the trade balance. In the fourth question, how can Trump's tariff policy influence the market for foreign currency exchange? When the hard tariff was implemented, it caused imports to decrease, shifting the demand curve in the market for foreign currency exchange to the right from D to D1. This shift led to an increase in the real exchange rate. However, the rise in the exchange value of the dollar offset the effect by reducing exports, leaving the trade balance unchanged. Finally, to explain why economists think Trump's tariff policy could not solve the trade imbalance problem with China, we can divide the explanation into three parts. First, limited impact. Some imported goods may not have substitutes in the domestic market, or the quality of the substitutes may not match that of imported goods. Secondly, retaliatory tariff. China typically responds with retaliatory tariffs on American goods, which harms U.S. exports, leading to a reduction in exports and further exacerbating the trade imbalance. Lastly, increased living costs. High tariffs lead to higher prices for imported goods, increasing the cost of living for consumers and production costs for businesses. This is the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.